It's funny, before I went live, I had this idea that I was going to talk about this question that comes up. If all of this manifestation, form, appearance, the world, Maya, the illusion, is a dream, is an appearance, then why do we suffer? Like, is suffering an illusion too? So when you watch the news, which you really shouldn't do, and you see all the suffering in the world, or you yourself know from your lived experience that there is suffering, it's undeniable that we suffer. In many ways, life is a kind of suffering because there's never enough, and it's always a seeking, and it has this tone of suffering, of aversion, and of grasping. But why would that be, and why would it matter? If all of this is just an appearance in the eternal no-thingness of the one reality. Why is it that Buddhists talk about compassion so compulsively? And Jesus talks about compassion so compulsively. Like, what is this purely because in the dream, the Buddha and Jesus were dream characters speaking to other dream characters in dreamish, speaking the language of dreamish? Or is there something deeper here, a deeper truth? And I've been feeling into this for a long time because I guess on one level, none of these questions matter, but on the other level, they're kind of the most important questions, because it's one thing to realize through a direct apprehension, not through the mind, but there's a direct experiential realization that all of this is empty of substance, is completely impermanent, is only happening as an appearance, much as a dream happens. When you wake up from a dream, you can look back on the dream and go, that never happened. Nothing happened. It was vapor. It was appearance. It was flickering images on a screen. But then you could feel into, well, but what was it like? What was it like in the dream? Let's say the dream was unpleasant. Bad things happened. There was loss. There was fear. There was anger. There was seeking. There was running. There was terror. There was pain in the dream. What was that like? Did it feel real? Was it happening in that sense? Well, I'll tell you the answer here is yes. Suffering it's such, how do I say this? Because it's unsayable, really. Human suffering, let's stick with that. Human suffering is experienced by a constellation of energy that, through a quirk of consciousness, thinks it's a separate being and is the source of attention, is the source of experiences. Everything is happening to it. So when a bad dream happens, and bad things happen in the dream, as they do in the dream of life, when consciousness takes this stance, apparently, as a separate being, the suffering is experienced as a separate being and as being absolutely real. So, in this sense, everything is emptiness. showing up as this radiant appearance of form. And through a quirk of it, the form itself is self-knowing. There's no self apart knowing any of it. It's all one instantiation happening mysteriously from a source that you can't know with the human mind, and yet you are it. And yet, as it spins up this world, part of those appearances are this awakeness, this thought space, this conscious presence that appears, that takes the conformation of a human, of you. And that you that it takes the conformation of suffers. And that suffering is absolutely happening. It's happening. So people will say, why try to wake up? When you wake up, why would you do anything when you realize it's all an illusion? Isn't that the deepest kind of nihilism, that this is a dream and you're done? Well, on one hand, yes, it is a dream. And the waking to realize there was no dreamer, there's only this, is one thing. And that's a beautiful, powerful realization. And with it comes a kind of unconditional love where you realize everything is this. And you're not apart from it. There's no you apart from it. So it's radical acceptance. And then that radical acceptance meets the knowing of suffering, that suffering is happening through the memory of its own suffering, but also just seeing it in the world, experiencing it. These apparent separate beings that are suffering terribly. And it's known that this suffering is real. And it arises then this unconditional, indescribable desire to love in the face of that suffering, to be concerned about that suffering, and to act in a way in the world that relieves that suffering. And none of this can be, you can't fake this, you can't copy this, you can't go, oh, Mother Teresa was really awake and spiritual, and I can just copy her degree of altruism and I'll be that way. This is different. This is knowing that you're not other, that there's just this, that it's a dream, and still, actually not even still, and because of that, showing up and realizing that this aberrancy of suffering is real. And these apparent beings are suffering. It's this deep paradox. There are no separate beings, and yet the separate beings suffer, and it matters. It matters more than anything, actually. It's a kind of urgency that you feel. And this is a paradox for the thinking mind, because the thinking mind is either or, either or. Well, either it's a dream or it's not. Either suffering matters because there's a physical reality and there's humans that are separate and they suffer and you don't want suffering, or there isn't. But what if it's both and? What if it's yes and? What if it's like in improv comedy, yes and? Well, it turns out reality is everything and nothing. It's so paradoxical that the mind would just shut down in the face of it, in the radiance of it. And so why? It's always why. The mind's asking why. So why do we care about suffering? Or why do you not care about suffering? Or if everything's a dream, well, the truth is, yes and, yes, this is a dream. Yes, there is suffering. Yes, it matters. Yes, it can't hurt what you are. Your true nature is not damaged by anything. It was never broken. It's always and eternally this. And yet, when it arises as suffering, it matters. There's nothing more you can say, really. Even these words are stupid. Forget all of them. Just feel into it. Next time you're meditating or you're sitting or you're watching the news or you're feeling, a child is having a bad day or a coworker's having a bad day, or more likely, you're having suffering. Feel into what is that? What is that? the one who's suffering, and you look for that and you realize, oh my God, it's all a misapprehension. It's all a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding that we are somehow separate and we have the capacity to suffer because we're apart and that we can control things, that can collapse. And that is the end of suffering. It's not the end of pain. It's not the end of the illusion. It's just the end of the one who suffers. And then you show up in the world manifesting this compassion. And it shows up in all kinds of different ways. Let me look at some comments here, because I've been talking a long time. And honestly, if I'm being totally truthful, what I wanted to convey about this is unconveyable, and I realize it the more I try to talk about it. So hopefully any of this is pointing into the void where this can actually be realized. But not by you, by your true nature, by what you actually are, which is the awakeness looking through your eyes and all eyes. And even that is mind stuff. It's impossible to talk about, and that's the closest I can get. So I don't know. Is there a solution for suffering? I don't know. I just know that it feels from here that suffering is real, that it matters, and that it can be seen through, in which case then it becomes optional.